Imagine being trapped in a raging snowstorm, the icy wind cutting through your fur, your tiny body trembling with cold. Now, imagine you're just a few weeks old, abandoned with no mother to protect you. 6 helpless golden retriever puppies cry out in the freezing night, their fragile bodies sinking into the snow, their whimpers barely audible over the howling wind. But just when all hope seems lost, fate leads them to the doorstep of an unexpected savior. What happens next is nothing short of a miracle. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you love stories of kindness and connection, we'd be grateful if you subscribed to hear more beautiful tales every day. The wind roared like a wild beast outside Margaret's cabin, shaking the wooden walls and rattling the frosted windows. Snow lashed against the glass in thick sheets, the darkness outside illuminated only by the occasional flicker of distant lightning. It was one of the worst snowstorms Margaret had seen in years, the kind that swallowed the world whole, leaving nothing but an endless, merciless white. She sat in her usual place by the fireplace, a woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. The old rocking chair creaked softly as she swayed, the flames casting long shadows on the walls of her modest home. It had been years since her house was filled with voices, with laughter and warmth that came from more than just the fire. Now it was just her and the howling storm outside. Margaret turned another page in her book, trying to focus on the words, but the isolation felt heavier tonight. There was something unsettling about the wind, the way it shrieked and moaned, pressing against her home like a living thing trying to force its way inside. Then she heard it. At first it was faint, just a whisper against the relentless howl of the storm, a sound so weak and fragile that she almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on her ears. But then it came again, a soft, desperate whimper. Margaret's hands stilled. She listened, holding her breath. Another cry. This time there was no mistaking it. She placed her book down and rose to her feet, heart pounding. The sound was distant but distinct. Something small, something vulnerable, calling out in the cold. A dog? No, a puppy. Margaret grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, her fingers trembling slightly as she flicked it on. The warm light illuminated the cabin's wooden walls, the familiar space that had been her sanctuary for decades. But right now there was no comfort in it. Something was out there, something that needed help. She hesitated for only a second before making her way to the door. The moment she unlatched it and pulled it open, the wind slammed into her like a wall of ice. A violent gust nearly pushed her back, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. Snow swirled in furious eddies, blinding and unrelenting. The night outside was a chaotic sea of white, the air thick with the sting of frozen flakes. Margaret lifted the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the snow-covered yard. Nothing. She took a step forward, boots sinking deep into the snow, her breath coming out in heavy clouds. The bitter cold bit into her face, but she didn't care. The cries were getting louder. She turned her head, straining her ears. There, off in the distance, Margaret waded forward, the wind nearly stealing her breath as she moved through the thick drifts of snow. The flashlight shook in her grip as she struggled against the storm. But then, her beam landed on something. She froze. Far ahead, just barely visible through the swirling snow, 6 tiny figures huddled together in the white abyss. Golden, small, trembling. Her breath caught in her throat. Puppies. 6 little golden retriever puppies, their fur soaked and matted with frost, their tiny bodies curled into each other in a desperate attempt to fight the cold. Some lifted their heads weakly, mouths opening in silent cries, too exhausted to make a sound. Margaret's heart clenched. Then she noticed something even more disturbing. The snow around them was untouched, no paw prints, no tracks leading to where they sat, trembling in the night. It was as if they had simply appeared there. Margaret's blood ran cold. Margaret's breath came out in ragged clouds as she forced her way through the knee-deep snow. The wind howled, whipping at her face, but she didn't stop. The sight of the 6 tiny puppies, helpless, trembling, barely clinging to life, pushed her forward. Her boots crunched heavily as she reached them, and she dropped to her knees without hesitation. The cold was merciless, but the small bodies huddled in the snow were even colder. Too cold. With trembling hands, she scooped them up, pressing them against her chest as best she could. Their fur was wet, stiff with frost. Their whimpers were weak, barely more than a whisper against the storm. They wouldn't survive much longer out here. Margaret tightened her hold and turned back toward the cabin. The added weight of the 6 puppies, combined with the deep snow and biting wind, made every step an ordeal. The storm fought against her, trying to pull her back into the abyss, but she refused to yield. One step, then another. Her breath burned in her chest, her fingers numb even beneath her gloves, but finally the faint glow of her cabin's window appeared through the swirling white. She pushed forward, heart pounding, praying she wasn't too late. The moment she stepped inside, she kicked the door shut behind her and collapsed onto the wooden floor, the puppies still clutched against her chest. Warmth enveloped her instantly, but the puppies remained cold, too cold. Margaret quickly sprang into action. There was no time to waste. She grabbed a thick woolen blanket from the chair and wrapped each tiny body with care, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had once fought to save lives in an emergency room. She had been a nurse for over 40 years. She had seen people slip away in hospital beds, powerless to stop it. But this she could control. Margaret reached for the hot water bottle she always kept by the fireplace and tucked it gently between them. Then she began rubbing their small bodies, using firm but careful motions to stimulate circulation. "Come on, little ones," she murmured, her voice shaking as she worked. "Stay with me." Their fur was still damp, their bellies still too cool to the touch. Margaret pressed one against her chest, feeling for the faint rise and fall of its tiny ribs. Breathing. Good. Then she reached for the smallest one, and her heart stopped. The tiny body was limp. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Its chest wasn't rising. No. She quickly placed 2 fingers against the fragile ribcage, feeling for movement, anything. But the little thing lay still in her palm, its fur barely moving under her breath. Her mind flashed back to a hospital room, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the beeping of a monitor slowing, then stopping, the helpless feeling of watching a patient slip away. Not this time. Margaret began rubbing faster, using both hands now, warming the small body, willing it back to life. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "Fight, just a little more." She cupped her hands around the tiny muzzle and exhaled softly, letting the warmth of her breath seep in. Seconds passed like hours, then a twitch. Margaret gasped. The puppy shuddered, its tiny chest rising just a fraction. Another second, then a weak, shallow breath. Tears welled in her eyes. "There you go," she whispered, cradling it closer. "That's it. Keep breathing." She continued rubbing gently, and after another agonizing moment, the little puppy released a faint, barely audible whimper. Relief crashed over her like a wave. Margaret looked at the rest of the litter, who were now nestled against each other beneath the warm blanket. Their breathing was slow but steady. She let out a shaky sigh and leaned back against the chair, exhaustion settling in. It wasn't over yet, but for now they had won this battle. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the small wooden cabin. Margaret sat on the floor, her back against the rocking chair, exhaustion creeping into her bones. The 6 puppies were nestled together on a thick woolen blanket near the hearth, their tiny bodies finally warm, their breathing slow and steady. For the first time since she had found them, they weren't trembling. The smallest one, the one she had nearly lost, was curled against the hot water bottle, its fragile chest rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths. Margaret gently ran her fingers over its soft fur, still damp but no longer ice-cold. They had survived the night,
But the question still lingered, gnawing at her thoughts. Where was their mother? Margaret knew enough about dogs to understand that puppies this young couldn't have made it this far on their own. A mother would never willingly abandon her litter, and yet, when she had found them in the snow, there had been no tracks, no signs of another dog anywhere.
It didn't make sense. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky outside in pale streaks of pink and gold, Margaret knew she needed answers. Later that morning, after making sure the puppies were settled, she wrapped herself in her thickest coat and set out toward her closest neighbor's house, Walter Dawson, a retired veterinarian. If anyone would know what to do, it was him. The snow crunched under her boots as she trudged through the icy landscape. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine white world. The wind had died down, but the air was still bitterly cold, stinging her cheeks as she walked. Walter's house wasn't far, just a half-mile down the road, a sturdy, well-kept cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. She knocked on the door, and within moments it swung open. Walter, a man in his 70s with a thick grey beard and kind eyes, squinted at her in surprise. "Margaret, what are you doing out in this cold?" She wasted no time. "I need your help." Sitting at Walter's kitchen table, Margaret recounted everything: the storm, the cries in the night, the 6 frozen puppies in the snow. Walter listened intently, his brows furrowed in concern. When she finished, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's strange," he muttered. "A litter that young wouldn't survive long without their mother, and you're sure there were no tracks?" Margaret shook her head. "Not a single one. It was as if they just appeared." Walter's expression darkened. "That's not right." He got up and walked over to a drawer, rummaging through old papers before pulling out a small notebook. He flipped through it quickly before stopping at a page and nodding to himself. "A few weeks ago," he said, "one of my neighbors told me something odd. Said they saw a man pull up to the edge of the forest, just off the old highway. He got out, opened the back of his truck and—" Walter's jaw tightened. "Threw a pregnant golden retriever out into the snow, then he just drove off." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What?" Walter nodded grimly. "They tried to follow, but the dog ran into the woods before they could reach her. They figured she wouldn't make it in this cold, but if she survived, and if she gave birth—" Margaret swallowed hard. "Then that could be their mother." The thought made her chest ache. A mother dog, abandoned in the dead of winter, forced to give birth alone in the wilderness. And yet, somehow, her puppies had ended up outside Margaret's cabin. "But how did they get there?" she asked, more to herself than to Walter. "That's over 10 miles away. These puppies can barely walk." Walter exhaled heavily. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Margaret sat in silence, gripping the warm mug of tea Walter had made her. Somehow these puppies had travelled miles through a deadly blizzard, or had something or someone brought them to her. And if their mother was still out there, she might not have much time left. That night the storm had passed, but the weight in Margaret's chest remained. She sat by the fire, her eyes drifting to the sleeping puppies curled up together on the thick wool blanket. They were warm now, their tiny chests rising and falling with soft, steady breaths, alive, safe, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Their mother was still out there. Walter's words haunted her. A man had abandoned a pregnant golden retriever in the forest, and no one had seen her since. If she had survived long enough to give birth, then she must have fought through freezing nights, hunger and exhaustion just to keep them alive, and now she was gone. Margaret exhaled slowly, trying to push the thoughts away. She needed rest. The long day had drained her, and the warmth of the fire was pulling her into drowsiness. She leaned back against her chair, her heavy eyelids fluttering shut. And then she dreamed. The air was thick with silence. Margaret found herself standing in her cabin, but the room felt different, colder. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving only dying embers, and an eerie silver light seeped through the frosted window panes, and then she saw it. A golden retriever stood outside, just beyond the window. Her fur was pale gold, but wet and matted, clumped with ice and frost. She was thin, far too thin, her ribs visible beneath her damp coat. Her legs trembled from exhaustion, yet she remained standing. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The dog was staring straight at her. Her eyes, deep, desperate, pleading, the kind of look Margaret had seen before, in hospital rooms, in patients who had fought too long, who were barely hanging on but still refused to give up. The dog took a single step forward, pressing her nose against the cold glass. Margaret wanted to move, wanted to open the door, to let her in, to save her. But before she could, the world shifted. The window vanished into darkness, and Margaret woke up. She bolted upright, heart hammering. The fire was still burning, the puppies still sleeping. But the feeling lingered, like ice curling around her spine. She knew that wasn't just a dream. Margaret pressed a hand against her chest, trying to calm herself, but the image of the mother dog's eyes, so full of pain, yet so filled with hope, wouldn't leave her mind. She glanced at the window. The frost still clung to the glass, the snow outside untouched. Yet deep inside her something was pulling at her, a feeling she couldn't ignore. She had spent her whole life trusting her instincts as a nurse, and now every part of her was screaming the same thing. The mother was still out there, and she was waiting for Margaret to find her. Without another second of hesitation, Margaret stood up, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the cold. The wind howled like a restless spirit as Margaret pulled on her thickest coat, fastening the buttons with trembling fingers. The cold was unforgiving, but the pull in her chest, the undeniable certainty that something, someone was out there waiting for her, was stronger. She wrapped a wool scarf tightly around her neck, grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, and reached for her boots. The moment she stepped outside, the storm swallowed her whole. Snow whipped violently through the air, sharp like shards of glass against her exposed skin. The landscape beyond her cabin was nearly invisible, an endless stretch of white and shadow. The ground beneath her boots was uneven, buried under thick, untouched snowdrifts. It would be so easy to get lost. And yet she walked. Margaret moved forward with determination, her feet crunching through the ice, every step a battle against the wind. Her flashlight's beam barely cut through the storm, but she kept it pointed forward, scanning the white abyss ahead. She had no clear direction, no logical path to follow, only instinct. It wasn't the first time in her life she had trusted something she couldn't explain. She had spent decades in hospitals, in emergency rooms, watching as patients hovered between life and death. Sometimes science wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to listen to the quiet voice deep inside, the one that whispered, "Go now," or "Don't give up yet." And tonight, it was telling her to keep moving. Minutes blurred into an eternity as she trudged through the snow. The cold crept beneath her coat, biting at her bones. Her legs ached with the effort of wading through knee-high drifts, her breath coming out in labored gasps. The flashlight flickered slightly, struggling against the thick curtain of falling snow. Then a shape. Margaret froze, squinting against the wind. A shadow, barely visible through the swirling white. She took a shaky step forward, then another. The flashlight's beam steadied, cutting through the haze, and her breath caught, a golden shape, half buried in the snow. Margaret's chest tightened. No, please no. She moved faster, the pain in her legs forgotten. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she closed the distance, heart pounding in her ribs. She knew what she would find before she even reached it. And yet, it still stole her breath away. A golden retriever, motionless in the snow. Margaret dropped to her knees beside the dog, her own body sinking into the freezing ground. The wind howled around them, but she barely heard it. Everything else faded. The dog's fur was matted with ice, golden but dulled by the frost. Snow clung to her frail frame, her ribs too visible beneath the thin layer of fur. But it was her eyes that broke Margaret's heart. She was still conscious, barely. The dog's half-lidded eyes were open, fixed on something in the distance. Margaret followed her gaze, the direction of the cabin, the direction of her puppies. A sob caught in Margaret's throat. She'd been trying to get back to them. Even in the freezing cold, even while starving, even with no strength left, this mother had fought to return to her children. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat and reached out, her gloved hands gently brushing over the dog's side. She was still breathing, but barely. "Hang on, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, voice breaking. The dog's body was stiff with cold, her muscles barely responding. Her breathing was shallow, and her heartbeat, when Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, was weak, so weak. But she was alive, and as Margaret stroked her frost-covered fur, the dog's eyes shifted ever so slightly, looking up at her, a flicker of recognition, a spark of something, trust. Margaret felt her own tears freeze on her lashes. "I've got you," she murmured. "I've got you." She had to get her back. Gathering every ounce of strength she had, Margaret moved carefully, lifting the dog into her arms. She was heavier than the puppies, but far too light for a full-grown retriever. Her body was frail, malnourished, a testament to how long she had suffered out here alone. Margaret pulled her close, wrapping her own coat around her as best as she could. The wind lashed at them both, but she didn't care. One step, then another. The journey back was harder, the added weight making every movement agonizing. Her boots sank deeper into the snow, her legs screaming with effort. But she didn't stop. The mother dog stirred faintly in her arms, and Margaret held her closer. She wasn't going to lose her now. By the time Margaret reached the cabin, she could barely breathe. Her body screamed for rest, her limbs trembling as she stumbled onto the porch. The heat from inside spilled out the moment she kicked the door open, warm air colliding with the frozen skin on her face. She nearly collapsed onto the wooden floor, but she forced herself to stay upright. The puppies were still huddled on the blanket, fast asleep. But as soon as the door opened, their tiny heads lifted. Margaret carefully lowered the mother dog onto the rug near the fire, her arms shaking with the effort. She worked quickly, unwrapping her coat from around the freezing body, grabbing towels, warm blankets, anything to fight the cold from creeping in further. Then she sat beside her, rubbing her sides, just as she had done with her smallest puppy the night before. "Come on," she whispered. "Stay with me." The mother dog barely moved. Margaret leaned in, listening for breath. There. Faint, but there. She rubbed harder, warming her with her hands, whispering soft reassurances. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, a tremble. Margaret's breath hitched, a flicker of movement. The dog's ribs rose and fell, slightly deeper than before. Another few seconds passed, then her eyelids fluttered. Margaret let out a shaky sob of relief. "Good girl," she whispered. "You're home now." As the mother dog lay there, exhausted but alive, the puppies, as if sensing something, began stirring. One by one they lifted their tiny bodies, blinking sleepily. Then they saw her, their mother. A chorus of small, eager whimpers filled the cabin. Margaret barely had time to react before the tiny bodies rushed forward, stumbling over each other in their excitement. The mother dog, weak as she was, opened her eyes fully now. And as the first puppy nuzzled into her, as their tiny paws climbed over her frozen body, she let out the softest, most exhausted sigh. A mother's sigh. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking back tears. She had made it. They had made it. And for the first time in a long, long time, Margaret believed in miracles again. Chapter 6. Winter's Embrace. The warmth of the fire flickered softly against the walls of Margaret's cabin. Outside, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a quiet, snow-covered world. But inside, there was still a battle to be fought. The mother dog lay motionless on the thick blanket near the hearth. Her breathing was shallow, her fur still damp from the ice that had clung to her frail body. The only sign of life was the gentle rise and fall of her ribs, barely noticeable beneath the golden coat that once must have been thick and beautiful, but was now dull and thinned from malnutrition. Margaret knelt beside her, one hand pressing gently against her side, feeling for warmth. Too cold. She had seen this before, bodies shutting down from hypothermia, clinging to that thin thread of life, the body too exhausted to fight back.
But Margaret had spent a lifetime fighting for others, and she wasn't about to stop now.
She reached for another blanket and draped it carefully over the dog, tucking it around her fragile body. Then she picked up a fresh towel and began gently rubbing her fur, careful but firm, encouraging warmth to return. "You're not leaving them," she murmured, her voice soft but commanding.
As if in response, the dog's ear gave a faint twitch.
Margaret's heart clenched. She was still here. Hours passed in careful tending. Margaret moved with the quiet determination of an old nurse who had spent decades caring for patients in critical condition. She monitored the mother dog's breathing, massaged her stiff limbs, made sure her body temperature was slowly rising. The puppies had curled up around her, pressing their tiny bodies into her side. They didn't understand what had happened. They only knew that the warmth of their mother was near, and they clung to her instinctively. Margaret watched as one of the bigger puppies crawled over, pressing his small nose against her fur, whimpering softly. Then the smallest one, the one that had nearly died in her hands the night before, did the same. Margaret reached out, brushing her fingers through his soft fur. "She's coming back," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was meant for the puppies or herself. She closed her eyes for just a second, exhaustion weighing on her bones. She had barely slept since she found them. But she wouldn't rest, not until she knew they were all safe. Then, the faintest movement made her eyes snap open. A shudder ran through the mother dog's body. Her breathing deepened, and then with a slow, effortful blink, her golden eyes opened. For a moment she didn't move. Margaret held her breath, waiting. The mother dog's gaze was hazy, unfocused, but as she blinked again, awareness returned. She shifted slightly, her tired muscles twitching beneath the weight of exhaustion. Then a soft whimper, not from pain, not from fear, recognition. Margaret exhaled shakily, tears pricking her eyes. "There you are," she whispered. "I knew you'd come back." The dog didn't react at first, her breathing still slow, but then her head moved, just slightly, and she saw them. The puppies, all 6 of them, pressed against her side, their tiny bodies warm, their tails wagging in hesitant excitement. Another soft whimper escaped the mother dog's throat. Her eyes softened. Then she lifted her head, just enough to touch one of them with her nose. It was so small, so simple. But it was everything. Margaret let out a slow breath, pressing a hand to her chest. She had witnessed moments like this before, a patient waking up after being thought lost, a heartbeat returning where there had been silence. But this was different. This was life choosing to fight. The puppies immediately reacted, clambering toward their mother, licking her, pawing at her, as if to make sure she was real. The mother dog let out a low, exhausted sigh. And then, in the gentlest movement, she curled her body just slightly, just enough to pull them in. Margaret smiled. She had made it back to them. As the night deepened, Margaret sat beside them, watching over them with quiet reverence. She felt something stirring deep in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For so long she had told herself she was content with solitude, that her life had been full enough, that she had done her part. She had saved lives. She had cared for others. But as she looked at the mother dog now surrounded by her puppies, their tiny bodies breathing in time with hers, she realized she still had more to give. These tiny lives had found their way to her against all odds. The storm should have taken them, the cold should have stolen them. But they had survived, and so had she. Margaret let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Looks like we saved each other, huh?" she murmured, reaching out to scratch behind the mother dog's ear. The dog blinked up at her, tired but content, and then she gently rested her head in Margaret's lap. Margaret stilled, a lump forming in her throat. It was trust. It was gratitude. It was home. And in that moment, as the fire crackled softly, as the storm outside finally gave way to a silent, star-filled sky, Margaret knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The morning sunlight filtered through the frosted window panes, casting a golden glow across the wooden cabin. The storm had long since passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white. Inside, warmth filled the space, not just from the crackling fire in the hearth, but from something deeper, something Margaret hadn't felt in years, the feeling of belonging. The mother dog lay peacefully beside her puppies, her golden fur no longer dull, but slowly regaining its softness. Though still weak, she had begun to eat again, her body pressing protectively against her litter as they nursed. She was healing. Margaret sat nearby, a cup of tea cradled between her palms, watching them with quiet reverence. The past few days had felt like a lifetime, from the moment she found the puppies in the snow, to the desperate search for their mother, to the long nights spent nursing them all back to life. She had saved them, and somehow she felt like they had saved her too. A knock at the door broke the silence. Margaret blinked, startled, before setting down her cup and rising to her feet. She wasn't expecting visitors. No one came this far into the woods in the dead of winter, unless they had a reason. She pulled open the door to find Walter Dawson standing there, bundled in a heavy coat, a thick woolen scarf wrapped around his neck. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another man, tall, middle-aged, with sharp but kind features. He carried a weathered black bag, instantly recognizable. A vet. Margaret furrowed her brows. "Walter?" The old vet gave her a small smile, his beard dusted with frost. "Morning, Margaret. Thought I'd bring a friend. This here is Dr. Elliot Barnes. He runs the animal clinic in town. I told him about your situation." Dr. Barnes stepped forward, offering his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Walter said you've had quite an adventure." Margaret chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." Walter nudged his way inside, brushing off the cold. "Elliot wanted to check on the mother dog. Make sure she's recovering properly." Margaret hesitated, glancing back at the sleeping dogs. "She's doing much better, but I'd appreciate that." Dr. Barnes moved with practiced ease, kneeling beside the mother dog as she stirred slightly. He murmured softly, his hands gentle as he checked her pulse, lifted her paws, and inspected her fur. Margaret watched as he worked, his touch confident but compassionate. The puppies barely stirred, still curled up in their warm little world. "She's lucky," he finally said, adjusting his glasses. "A few more hours out there, and she wouldn't have made it. But she's strong. She fought." Margaret exhaled, relief washing over her. "So she'll be okay?" Dr. Barnes nodded. "With proper care, absolutely." A smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but before she could respond, his gaze shifted, landing on something on the table. His expression changed instantly. Margaret followed his eyes and realized he was staring at an old photograph. A single-framed picture, one that had sat there for decades, gathering dust. It was a photo of Margaret, her late husband, and a golden retriever. Margaret's breath caught. Dr. Barnes reached for the frame, picking it up with careful hands. His brow furrowed as he studied the image, his eyes darting between the dog in the photo and the mother dog resting on the floor. Then, softly, he murmured, "This dog looks exactly like her." Walter turned, glancing over his shoulder. His face shifted from curiosity to something deeper, shock. Margaret felt her heartbeat in her throat. Dr. Barnes looked at her, his voice quieter now. "How long ago was this taken?" Margaret swallowed hard. 20 years. Silence. Walter let out a slow breath. "That's uncanny." Margaret's grip tightened on the chair. She had known, of course, that the resemblance was there. She had noticed it the first night the mother dog had curled up by the fire. But she had dismissed it, told herself it was just coincidence. But now, standing here, looking at the photograph, looking at the dog, it didn't feel like a coincidence at all. Dr. Barnes set the frame down, shaking his head slightly. "It's almost as if—" He hesitated before finishing the thought. "She came back to find you." Margaret's fingers trembled. She looked down at the mother dog, sleeping soundly, surrounded by her puppies. She had no explanation, no logic to grasp onto. Only a quiet, overwhelming truth settling deep in her chest. Somehow, in some way, she had found her way back. Margaret sat in silence long after Walter and Dr. Barnes had left. The weight of the revelation pressed against her ribs, but not in a painful way. It was comforting, like the feeling of an old friend's hand on her shoulder, a familiar presence in an unfamiliar world. She reached out, running her fingers gently over the fur of one of the puppies. His tiny body was warm, steady, alive. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She had always believed in fate, in the invisible threads that wove lives together, that brought people and creatures to where they were meant to be. And now, looking at the sleeping mother dog, she knew some bonds were never truly broken. Some souls always found their way back home. Margaret let out a soft, trembling laugh, brushing away the tear. She reached for one of the puppies, lifting him carefully into her arms. "You're staying right here," she murmured. "All of you." Outside, the wind had died down, replaced by the quiet stillness of a world blanketed in fresh snow. But inside, Margaret had never felt warmer. As Margaret sat in her warm cabin, surrounded by the soft breaths of 6 tiny puppies and their recovering mother, she knew this was no accident. The blizzard could have claimed them all. The puppies should never have survived the cold. The mother should have been lost forever in the storm. And yet, here they were. Margaret had spent her life caring for others. As a nurse, she had witnessed both the fragility and resilience of life. She had seen people fight, seen them heal, seen them hold on when all odds were against them. And now she had seen it again, not in a hospital room, but here, in the silent language of a mother dog who refused to give up on her children. The strength of a mother's love, even when the storm raged, even when her body was weak and frozen, she had tried to come back. That was the kind of love only God could create, the kind that endured all pain, all suffering, and still remained unbroken. The power of kindness. Margaret thought she was saving them, but in truth, they had saved her. In the quiet moments, in the soft warmth of their tiny bodies pressed against her, she realized that God had sent them, not just to be rescued, but to rescue her as well. The miracle of fate. Some might call it coincidence, but Margaret knew better. God's hands had been in every step of this journey. He had led her outside that night. He had given her the strength to carry the mother dog back through the storm. And he had brought them together again after 20 years. God's love moves in mysterious ways, guiding us even when we don't understand why. Sometimes the blessings we receive aren't the ones we ask for, but the ones we need the most. A final blessing. Margaret gently stroked the mother dog's fur, whispering, "You were meant to find me." And maybe, just maybe, God had meant for them to find each other. May this story remind us all that love endures, kindness matters, and God's plan is always greater than we can see. May He bless you, guide you, and bring light into your life, just as He brought these little souls to Margaret's door. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still happen, even in the coldest storms. God bless you.